This is Grape Video 26, Pruning Grapevines Before a Vineyard's Second Growing Season. In our previous videos, 20 through 24, we talked about basic skills of a grape pruner. In video number 25, we talked about pruning vines just before or slightly after they're planted. Now we're thinking 1 year further down the road, and how are we going to prune grapevines after we've had them in the ground for 1 year? If you're not familiar with grapevine terminology, you may want to review terms in grape videos 1 to 3 before proceeding with this video. Well, we're going to start with this newly planted vineyard early in its first growing season. The vines have just begun to grow. We have good weed control around the vines, some trickle irrigation along those rows. And this is a good time to tell you that my experience with commercial grape production is such that most of the time we grow the vineyard in its first year on the ground like this. Oh yes, there's certainly some major advantages for putting the trellis in right up front, right when you plant the vines. But it's also costly, and it's very time consuming when a grower has many other things to do in the spring. So for that reason, most of the time my experience has been with putting the trellis in between the first and second year of the vineyard. So let's go back to the picture here. Here we have vines that are managed well. There's no weeds developing around the vines. There's no weeds in the row middles. Everything is neat and tidy. And so when we have a situation like this, we can expect very good growth in the first year of the vineyard if the vines are indeed healthy themselves. And Jaime here dug up at the end of the first year these long roots, perhaps 4.5, maybe even 5 feet long, when we grew vines well under ideal conditions that were weed-free, fertilized well, irrigated, and vines growing on the ground at the end of the first growing season. This is a very good first year start for these vines growing on the ground. In contrast, the experiment that we were conducting at this time allowed us to have one treatment where we did everything wrong. We had lots of weeds around the grapevines. You can see in the foreground one of the new grapevines, but the rest of them are buried in the weeds. We did not fertilize, we did not irrigate, and we allowed all those stresses to have their impact on the grapevine. And what was the greatest stress? Weeds. And we're going to get into that when we do videos on vineyard establishment. But what I'm trying to convey to you is that what we do in the second year of a vineyard has everything to do with what happened to that vineyard in its first year. And look at this. This is a picture of those vines early in the second year of the vineyard. And in the background, those are vines that were well cared for in several ways. And in the foreground, planted at the same time, vines that were abused and stressed in several ways so that the growth was very, very poor. So we can't talk about how to manage vines in the second year of a vineyard without some reference to what happened in its first year of growth. And we're going to then go over this topic of second year management of grapevines relative to the first year experience of the vines. Okay, let's start out with what we'll call situation 1. The start of year 2 in the life of a vineyard, situation 1, where we have had very poor growth in year 1. And the mature canes that got woody were only 2 feet long or even less. What do we do in that situation? Well, our course of action, for one, is to correct the problems that cause that poor growth. If we don't correct those problems, we're probably just going to have poor growth the second year and so on and so on. So we have to identify the source of the stresses that cause the poor growth. And we'll deal with that when we talk about vineyard establishment. But let's just assume now we have a situation where we had poor growth of the vines in the first year. Well, then all we can do is prune back those vines to the longest healthy cane that was produced on the vines. Let's take a look at some examples. Here again is that picture with those stunted vines in the foreground that are just barely growing at the start of their second year. We would prune those back to the longest healthy cane and tie them up, and if we made a schematic of that, it would look something like this. There we have it. A very short cane, cut as long as possible, tied up, and let those shoots grow out. Well, let's liken the various types of experiences a first-year vineyard can have to an academic experience in school. Here's a young fella, and at the end of the school year, Miss Goody here gives him his report card and says, "Johnny boy, you did well this year. You got a B+ for your final grade, and you can go from 6th grade to 7th grade. Congratulations, you're being promoted." Uh-oh. What if the situation's quite different? What if little Johnny didn't do so well, and his final grade was an F? And Miss Goody says, "Sorry, Johnny boy, you're not going to 7th grade. You've got to repeat 6th grade next year and come back and be with me another year." Oh, golly gee whiz. Ugh. Well, that's what we need to do with a grapevine. If in the first year it had poor growth and it didn't mature canes very long, we have to make it repeat year 1. It doesn't get promoted to go on to year 2 management. Let's kind of look at a situation that might resemble this. Here is a grapevine at the start of the second year. And it's a little hard to see, so we're going to outline the canes coming up from the ground out of this pile of wood chips to show you what it looks like. There. Now, those canes are no more than 2 feet long, and they're a lot less actually. Let's take the yellow lines away. There, you can see it again. So as if that weren't problem enough, when this small grapevine started to grow in its second year, there were additional problems. Here it is, a little better picture showing what the canes look like, but on May 6th things were looking good. About 2 weeks later though, there was a problem. Yep, we had a spring freeze. And I hope you can see that all the shoots that were emerging on this unpruned vine were dying back. And so everything was burnt back to the ground, so to speak. And we had to start all over again. We couldn't even start with a short cane. So we tied up the longest possible cane like this, and we waited to see what happened. Well, by about a month later, things are looking better. The growth is coming up from the ground. We've got good weed control around the vines. That's important. We have fertilized the vines. We have sprayed them to keep them from getting mildewed. And things are looking a lot better than a month ago when they had a spring freeze. We made these vines repeat the course of year one. They're growing quite well because the root system was developed, but the above ground portion failed us with small growth and a spring freeze. Well, by September of the second year, things do look very nice. These vines at the end of their second year have recovered. They're going on to make a nice vineyard. So the point is, if you don't have good vine growth in year one, then in year two, make the vines repeat the course. And by that we would mean just allow 6 or 8 shoots to grow, train them up, tie them up, we'll get to that in a minute, and keep them healthy and get back on track with a healthy, productive vineyard. Okay, let's look at another situation of grapevines in their second growing season. These particular vines were winter killed to the ground by a very severe winter. And so the shoots started from the ground and were trained up and out a wire to begin the training of mid-wire cordon training. We're going to take a look at this vine closer to see how this is done. Here we are. At the base of the vine, a piece of twine has been tied on a dead spur, and then it has been tied to the wire that's going to be used for the mid-wire cordon. And as the 2 shoots grew, that you can see here, they were twisted around that twine. The twine was not put around the shoots. The shoots were twisted around the twine so that they were held very nice and straight. Before we start watching this, I just want to say that I would not use plastic twine as shown here because it never deteriorates in the vineyard and it becomes a nuisance. I would always recommend the use of a natural twine like jute, and when you do that, make sure it's at least a 3-ply twine, because if you only use 2-ply, it's not going to hold up for the season. But you don't have to worry about that twine. It will deteriorate over time and not be a problem in the vineyard. Let's watch exactly how this vine was trained up in its second year. Here we go. From that spur where the orange plastic twine was tied, the shoot as it grew was placed around the twine. Here's the top of the twine on the wire. Then that long shoot as it developed was now twisted around the wire that ultimately will become the cordon. If you use this approach to second year management of the vine, you have to really tend to these vines extremely well because you've put all your effort of this vine into 2 or 3 shoots, and they must be taken care of well, or you jeopardize the advancement of this vine into its productive cycle in the 3rd year and beyond. Okay, let's go on to a second situation. What if we have just the opposite? Instead of just okay growth or average growth, what if we have excellent growth in year 1? What if we have some canes that grow 6 to 8 feet long, or maybe even more? What can we consider to do then in the second year? Well, the course of action could be, if the cane growth is long enough, begin establishing the permanent vine training system, we can go right to what we often do in the third year, right in the second year if we have cane growth that is long enough. Let's look at a couple schematic pictures to explain this. Here is the start of mid-wire cordon training with two trunks coming up from the ground and the start of a cordon along that 42-inch wire, and that's much like we pictured in Grape Video 7 when we talked about mid-wire cordon training. Well, if the canes that developed in the first year are long enough, we can train them up and establish the new trunk and the cordon all in one step, just like this. Why wait till the third year? And after the second year and starting into the third, this is what the mid-wire cordon training system might look like. But we covered all that back in Grape Video 7. Okay, now we're going to go to what I consider the more typical or average approach to year 2. Let's say we've had good shoot growth in year 1, and by that we mean that many canes have developed to ripen off and have a nice woody, mature growth of 4 to 6 feet or more. In that case, the average situation or the typical situation for managing vines in year 2 would look something like this. Our course of action: prune to 1 or 2 canes. And we're going to show you what we mean by that. Prune those canes as long as possible up to just below the top wire of the trellis, and then tie those canes up to the top wire. And we're going to get to the details of this right now. Here's one schematic. We have a vine. Let's say this is a grafted vine so that we only have one trunk coming up from the ground, and then at the graft union we choose 2 long canes as long as possible up to the top wire, and we tie the 2 canes as shown here to the top wire. Now, on the topic of tying, we're going to have 1 or more videos just on the specific techniques of tying, so I'm not going to go off on that. We're talking about pruning right now. But let's just say for the moment we're going to tie those canes up to the top wire with some twine like this. That's one approach to managing an average well-grown vine in its second year. Well, if we're not dealing with grafted vines, perhaps we do something like this. We bring up 2 independent canes from the ground or near the ground so that they're really rather independent from each other. And we do the same thing essentially as the previous schematic with 2 canes to the top, and we tie them like this. I like when we tie them, when we have those 2 canes, to spread them out in year 2 because we can get the growth distributed better. We'll have less shading of one shoot by another. So I would tie them like this because this is not going to be the permanent system or the permanent structure of the vine. We're going to reconfigure it in year 3. So spread it out to get more uniform growth on the trellis. This is what that kind of looks like. This is June 16th on the second year of growth of these vines. And the shoots are just starting to grow. And by the end of the growing season, boy, this trellis is going to be so full of growth we won't be able to see to the other side. I'm conditioned to grow grapes in a cool climate where we can get winter injury through the dormant period. But perhaps you won't be in that situation. Or perhaps when you prune your vines into the second year, you can't get too long canes, and so you may elect to bring up just one cane like this. If you do, you may want to add a spur, if it's available, at the base of the vine to ensure that you have the opportunity of a second cane for a second trunk in the years ahead. Or you may not need to do that if there is a lot of growth near the base of the vine, depending upon the variety you're growing, etc. But you may want to opt for that spur. So at times, bringing up a single cane like this will make sense if you're in a situation where you're not concerned about winter injury or you're dealing with very, very hardy varieties. Well, here is the growth of a new vineyard in its second growing season, about mid-growing season, July 31st. And you can see how this is taking place. Now, this was done a long time ago when there was orange plastic twine being used in this vineyard. And I want to repeat again, don't do it. You will regret it, because it will be there forever, and you'll eventually have the cost of going in and cutting it out and taking it out of the vineyard. But this is what your vineyard might look like in its second year if you do some of the techniques that we've just described. As the shoots grow through the second growing season, as indicated in this schematic, you can get a very nice full canopy developing through the growing season, with shoots growing out everywhere and filling in the trellis quite nicely. And if you tend to your vines extremely well, by the end of the second growing season, you might completely fill the trellis with growth, as indicated in this slide. This is the Native American variety Niagara, the white grape that's used for juice. And we grew this experiment several years ago, and this was one of the most outstanding treatments, where we did everything well with weed control and fertilization and irrigation. And we were impressed with the amount of growth that we could display on the trellis by the end of the second growing season. And if you do things well, you can accomplish this also. This is an excellent start for the vineyard. Okay, we've talked about various ways to manage the vine in the second year, and although this is not about pruning, we're going to add on to this video a few tasks related to vines in a second growing year, just to help you through this part of establishing the vineyard, and we'll come back to this in later videos on vineyard establishment. The first thing is when to prune. When do you prune? It depends on how many vines you have to prune and your labor supply. As a rule of thumb, we want to prune as late as possible going into spring, in case we've had winter injury and we need to adjust to it. And we'll talk about that winter injury topic in another video. But generally, we don't like to prune early in the dormant period. We like to prune around March 1st or so, if you can get all of the pruning done and things tied up before growth begins. But the later the better. If you have a backyard vineyard with 12 vines, just wait till spring to prune them, because then you'll know what you're working with in case something happened to the vines through the winter. How many nodes or buds to retain on the vine? That's an important question. Now we're going to talk about that pruning severity, as we call it, for large mature vines in a separate video. But for a second year vineyard, we're going to make a rule of thumb that says, look at the growth of the vine as it occurred in the first year and see how many shoots matured into canes that were at least 4 feet long. Let's say, for example, that about 6 shoots matured into canes that are 4 feet long or longer. As a rule of thumb, take that number and multiply it by 2.5. So if you had 6 nice canes after the first year, leave about 15 shoots, 2.5 times 6, in the second year to grow the vine larger towards its full size. That's a rule of thumb that you can use. Now, if the vine does not perform well, we go back to this concept of making it repeat the course, and you go back to a very small number of growth shoots, like 4 to 6. Now, how should vines be tied in their second year? Well, there are lots of options. We're going to talk about a few of them. This is a picture of a shoot coming up in the second year, and I put this picture in here because if you look closely, there's a metal rod that is coming up from the ground up the trellis, and the shoot is being twisted around it to keep it nice and straight as a new young trunk. I do not favor the use of metal rods, bamboo rods, wooden stakes, or anything like that to train the vine up in its second year. Why? Because I think it's a lot easier, less costly to use twine, as we showed you a few slides ago, to bring up the vine with good tying techniques with twine, and you don't have to get into the cost of having these rods or stakes out, which then eventually you have to take out, store somewhere. That's my personal preference. I've brought up many new vineyards over the years, and we have never used rods or stakes, and they can perform just wonderfully. But this is a personal preference item. Someone else may influence you to use these. They're fine. It's just an additional cost that I don't really think is necessary. So let's go back to the twine thing. Once again, don't use the plastic twine. But this is another example of the use of twine that is tied onto a stub at the base of the vine, and then as that shoot grew, it was twisted around the twine to create a nice straight trunk for the years ahead. There's a close-up of that stub. We're going to show you that you don't have to have a stub like this at the base of the vine to make this technique work. You can do it just fine without it. And here's how you do it. We're going to outline as best we can the technique of using twine, and here we're using 3-ply jute twine. Excellent. Let's start the discussion by saying we're going to say that the twine is coming down from higher on the trellis right here, and then there's a section of the vine that is enlarged right about here, and that twine is brought around that to hold it together, and then we're going to use a different color, yellow, to show that that piece of twine is brought around, back up, and tied with a knot that will not slip. That's important, and we'll get into that when we talk about tying grapevines, so that we have a loop around a bottom portion of the vine. And when you do it this way, it will not tighten on the vine and girdle it. That's the problem. If that knot should slip and that twine should come down, it could girdle and actually cause problems with the growth of the vine. But you can do this. You don't need to have a stub to tie the twine to. you can do it with a loop just like this, and it'll work very, very well for you. There, we'll take those things away, and you can get a look again at that piece of jute twine that's tied around the base with a loop, and then we tie it up to a wire at the top of the trellis. Here is going back to a picture showing the stub technique with a piece of jute twine. When we get to the top and we tie this long cane that we've pruned to just below the top wire, it's important that we pull the cane up to the wire. Don't put the twine around the piece of cane and then put the twine over the wire and pull down, because you'll pull the wire down and the top wire will be going up and down as you go down the row. It sounds strange, but take that piece of twine, tie it around the cane, and then pull that cane tightly up and put the piece of twine over the wire and complete the knot that we'll talk about in another video. And you won't depress the wire, and you will have the cane standing nice and straight to form a nice straight trunk in the years ahead. Okay, what about some other things? Shoot adjusting and defruiting vines in their second year. Well, here's the schematic showing the growth all over the place when we tie up those two canes. But depending upon the training system you choose, you may want to adjust the shoots on those two canes to favor strong growth right where you're going to need it the next year for your training system. Let's illustrate that. Here is the start, once again, of a mid-wire cordon training system with a cane brought up and laid out a 42-inch wire. If you're going to use mid-wire cordon training, as we discussed in Grape Video 7, then you're going to want to favor the shoots just below that wire. So what we've done is to say you want to favor the shoots in that green oval, and you're going to want to remove the ones that are above that 42-inch wire, possibly if you have too many shoots growing, so that the ones below the 42-inch wire will do extremely well, and they'll be great candidates to establish your cordon in the following year. If you're going to grow vines on a top wire cordon training system like this, then schematically that training system looks something like this. And we discussed top wire cordon training in Grape Video 12. Then you want to favor the shoot growth in the second year that's just below that upper wire, so that you can find a nice strong cane to establish the cordon. So in this case, we've marked in red the shoots lower on the trellis that you might choose to remove early in their growth to favor the ones that are actually between the 42-inch wire and the 72-inch wire in the schematic. Hopefully we get this point across that at times you will want to shoot adjust to favor certain areas of growth on the trellis in the second year in preparation for training the vines in the third year. Now, when we leave a lot of shoots on the vine in the second year, they're going to produce grapes. And they can produce a lot of grapes. So we really don't want this to happen. The second year growth of a vine is for the main purpose of establishing the full size of the vine for the productivity of the vineyard in perhaps the third year of the vineyard and beyond. We should not be greedy to get crop in the second year. And if you leave this crop on, it's going to hold back the vegetative growth of the vine and keep it from developing adequate size. So, yes, defruit the vine to keep the growth of the vine concentrated in its vegetative development. Now there's a slight exception to this. Sometimes we're just curious to be sure that all the vines that we have are the correct variety, because sometimes we do get vines that don't turn out to be what we thought they were. So yes, it's okay to leave a couple clusters or so on a vine in the second year as a way of checking the trueness to variety of that vine before we get going down the road 3 and 4 years and finally find out that we've got some odd vines of Pinot Noir in our Chardonnay or something like that. So you can leave a couple of clusters per vine in the second year to make sure that they are the true variety that you chose. But don't leave a lot of fruit on the vine in the second year. Take it off just as early and as soon as you can. Well, that's it for pruning vines and some management of those vines in their second year. We hope this has been helpful to you. Until our next video, we'll say happy grape growing.